پرزنتر آخر این سشن دکتر کامران متین هستن که در زمینه اینترنشنال ریلیشنز در ساسکس یونیورسیتی تشریف دارن و تو حوزه متفاوت از جمله تحولات متغیر، مدرنیتی در جوامع غیر غربی و تاریخ و سیاست نوین یا مدرن در ایران و کردستان. کامران جان، فلور is yours.
من اینو یاد بگیرم فکر کنم برعکس من خودم به دیگران میگم برعکس
آینه بذارم
اوکی. ممنون شما برای معرفی و ممنون از همه که هستن اینجا. من پرزنتیشنم به متاسفانه یا خوشبختانه نمیدونم کدومش بهتره به انگلیسیه، ولی میخواستم فقط بگم چون قرارم تیبل آخرمون به فارسی باشه ذره جبران میشه اگر نه کسای انگلیسی خیلی خوب تعبیر نمی‌کنن. بحث من در مورد این هست که چطور هویت ملی در واقع یک مصداق از مفهوم جهان شمول یا یونیورسال هست و چرا این مفهوم به شکلی که در ناسیونالیسم ایرانی برساخته شده به نتایجی رسیده که می‌بینیم، یعنی ترکیب تفاوت و تکثر. بحث من اینجوری خواهد بود که اول من میخوام یه ذره در مورد رابطه بین هویت ملی و همین کاتگوری یا کنسپت یونیورسال یا جهان شمول در واقع. I was supposed to be speaking in English. Anyway, so I will start by talking about the link between national identity and the concept of universal. And then I look at the way in which the dominant strands of Iranian nationalism construct national identity as a form of universal identity in a particularly internalist process. And because of that, it leads to repression of difference and heterogeneity, or organizing difference in a hierarchical way. And then I look at the different ways in which universal can be constructed such that it preserves, not only preserves, it begins from the principle of heterogeneity. And then I look at Janjian Azadi as an instance of such a universal and how this can be the basis of a different kind of national identity in Iran. So before going through these steps, I would like to say a couple of things about my subject position. I think decades of feminist and post-colonial and race theories scholarship has told us that knowledge is always situated, and obviously that has implication for what one says. So I'm a straight man standing here in front of you. My first language is Kurdish. I grew up in a little town on the periphery of Iran itself, a periphery of the world. I experienced Islamic Republic as a 9-year-old boy. I experienced war, being refugee elsewhere within Kurdistan. I grew up in a family in which radical leftist politics intersected with Kurdish national politics, and these two actually have continued to shape my thinking. But I have also ended up in a very privileged Western institution, and that brings certain privileges to someone like me, but it has also some liabilities in terms of what I see or don't see. So that's where I stand. In terms of the contextualization of this particular talk, I want to say that this is a very tentative attempt to bring two lines of my research over the years. One is my sort of love and hate relationship with post-colonial theory. If you have read Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, he has this very impressive or, I don't know, memorable line when he says, Marxism is indispensable but is inadequate. And I have tried to show that post-colonial theory is also indispensable but is inadequate. And actually my working on the universal, the concept of universal was part of my critique of post-colonial critique, and I wanted to bring this into conversation with nationalism studies, which also has been my research recently, and it was, despite what my public appearances might suggest, I began my interest in nationalism not because I was particularly interested in defending or promoting Kurdish nationalism, but I wanted to understand where it comes from. Because in my own experience, actually, the concept of Kurdishness had gone through very different, very sharp, different iteration over time. So it could not be something essential to it. So, therefore, I'm trying to link this to kind of research in my academic kind of activities. So, I want to limit the subject of my talk by saying that I'm talking specifically about national identity, Iranianness as national identity, not cultural identity, not any kind of other identity. And I think this is very important because national identity is intrinsically linked to nation state, and by virtue of that is an intrinsically political issue, not a cultural issue. And this is something which, unfortunately, a big part of the Iranian left doesn't get it. So that's what I'm talking about. And collective identity, of which national identity is a form, in a particularly political one, in a space in which there are different groups of people, different kinds of collective identity, as you can see, logically involves some sort of universal conception. So if there is difference and you want to have a single identity facing outside, and that's something has been missing from our thinking, because national identity is not about glue specifically binding people together for the sake of it. It's always about binding together people facing an outside. And that's where I think the problem begins. How you construct a universal in a heterogeneous context that is democratic effectively. So if you look at Oxford English Dictionary, it says universal, one of the many meanings is extending over or including the whole of something specified or implied, especially the whole of a particular group or the whole of world. So universal is not always about the whole world, but any particular entity in its entirety. So the question of national identity, therefore, is about how national identity as a particular form of universal is constructed. And I'm going to argue, or show you hopefully, that Iranian nationalism in its dominant strands at least, does construct this national identity as universal through a particular intellectual movement, which I would describe as internalist. And because of that, whether it wants or not, it will repress difference, because it limits the subject of being universal as a singular. And more specifically, as you know better than me, Iranian nationalism, I don't talk about the ones, the strands which used to define Iranian national identity in racial terms, like being part of Aryan race and so on and so forth. That has been long before discredited. But the one which I think still has quite influence is the one which emphasizes, in fact, Persian language as the key element of this identity. Of course, there is Shiism as well, historically, in Iranian nationalism, but I want, for the sake of the argument here, focus more on the language. So, the claim of Iranian nationalism is somehow that this Persian language, which is now the expression of national identity in Iran and is the common bind, which brings people together within the Iranian plateau, is that Persian language goes back, God knows to when, thousands of years, and there is always this, passion about finding mentions of the word Iran in classical Persian literature, from the Sassanid period in Khodai Namaks and so on. And there is Iran and Iran, this like self and other, which is supposed to represent some sort of collective self, differentiated from collective other. And somehow it's dehistoricized, as if there has been some sort of common identity across the centuries, and all has been done in recent times is to have, kind of inscribe it on the nation state. And a key example of this, I think, story You can find in Ahmad Ashraf's quite, I think, eloquent text, but there are others who use the same sort of trope. So, in Ashraf there are these 6 different stages. The era of conception, Tadwin, Sasanian, Ghurur و دلتنگی, Abbasids and Samanian, then Asr Gereftegi, the Ghaznavis and Seljuks, reconstruction, Basazi, Mughals and Taymuris, and then returned in Safavis and the Bazgasht, and then Asr maybe at the contemporary time. So what is quite incredible is how this story of different stages sort of copies Marxist theory of history, in which different societies go through different modes of production and somehow they end up in this culmination of a socialist future and so on, and how this is then, and I don't have any evidence, but I suspect this has been influenced by the Soviet Marxist historiography in Iran, especially during the Pahlavi period. Now, what I think that there are a lot of problems with this story, obviously, but I think I'll just point out 3 of them. Why just it doesn't really explain what's been going on. First, I think the people who use this narrative conflate popular nationalism with official nationalism. So the very fact that in, I don't know, Khuday Namak or in Shahnameh or whatever, Iran has been mentioned, doesn't mean at all that a concept of Iran has existed and internalized by the entire population. Because, and that's very simple reason, because intellectual elites as well as political elites, by virtue of their position in the bureaucracy and political state, always face an outside which ordinary people, especially in the pre-modern times, don't face. So they always have, elites always have a much more sensitive conception of collective difference compared to the ordinary people. That's why, for example, in Kurdish nationalism, you have Khani, the famous poet, who talks about Kurds needing a state of their own in 1640, 8 years before Treaty of Westphalia and the birth of modern state. So Kurds, obviously, Kurdish nationalists would say, look, we are also a nation with long pedigree. But that's a very different idea of collective identity than what really modern nationalism means. So there is no, it doesn't mean just because Iran has been mentioned or Persian language has been used in the court, somehow the people who have inhabited this space therefore have all had some sort of association or usage of this language or this image of collectivity. And the other problem with this story is the problem actually with ethno-symbolist theories of nationalism, which basically this story is about. The idea that there are ethnies and these are cultural groups, and the nationalism as modern ideology comes and politicizes this cultural identity and turns them into modern nation. But ethno-symbolists like Anthony Smith and others can never properly explain why this happens. Well, nationalism comes in the absence of nation. And there is no sociological account of this. It's quite a political kind of claim about it. And in any case, if the Persian language existed in the way Iranian nationalists claim, and obviously there are evidence for it, its kind of universal spread cannot be really that far, because even in 1921, according to Arvand Abrahamian, only 5% of Iranian population were literate. And in the absence of modern technology, modern schools and media and so on, the idea that somehow all these people, even if their first language was not Persian, could speak and understand Persian is simply incorrect. So what Iranian nationalism really does when it talks about Iranian nation is that to turn what is supposed to be explained into the explainer. You instead of explaining where this thing we call Iranian nation has come from, it actually presupposes it and simply, puts it in a particular historical context. Now, the movement which Iranian nationalism does in so doing, I think, mirrors what Hegel does in constructing his concept of universal, which is not incidental. Someone like Tabatabai we talked about yesterday is so influenced by Hegel, obviously without referencing, because he doesn't reference anyone anyway. But what, how many minutes I have spoken?
You got 5 minutes.
Can you multiply by 5?
I think there are so many questions here. What we do, we can have 7-8 minutes discussion, and we can continue with questions, exchanges after lunch, before we start roundtable. So go on. You got 5 minutes anyway.
Okay. I do my best. I wish I had spoken a bit more faster than this. Anyway, so if you look at the introduction to the philosophy of world history in Hegel, he talks about universal as basically self-consciousness of the world spirit, which is the reason. So for him, universal is about a particular phenomenon to be able to rise above its particularity, i.e. to reflect and see, this and that. This is me, and this is not replicated anywhere else. So this is my particularities. And in so doing, actually, it's able to see what is broader and beyond him. And this is what he, Aufhebung, is kind of rising above itself. So in his story, basically reason moves from the east to the west, as you know, geographically moves, and in each stage it reaches a particular moment of its self-consciousness and so on. And of course it ends up in Europe, the highest stage of self-consciousness and the full freedom and so on and so forth. So you can see exactly this happens in Iranian nationalists. This goes about Persian. Somehow Persian is one particularity among others. Arab, Kurdish, whatever languages existed at the time. But it is the Persian which is able to, through history, rise above itself and reach this sense of universalism. And by virtue of that, anyone else who hasn't done that, so it's inferior and therefore be subsumed under it as bone or whatever, you name it. Of course, they wouldn't say that explicitly, but that's really what happens in reality. Now, this happens in Hegel because actually the reason for him is always in singular. And therefore, if a singular entity rises above itself, by definition, it remains singular. So other instances of difference either erased or subordinated. In his case, he would put them actually outside history. And he talks about that in relation to Africa. So Africa for Hegel were outside history, they just didn't matter at all. But we are lucky that, of course, this has been challenged. Tradition of thought have challenged this idea of universal and enlightenment thought, including Hegel and so on. I wanted to talk about two particular thinkers, but I will limit myself only to Sela Ben Habib, because obviously she is a feminist, but also a political philosopher. And she talks about how a different kind of universal can be constructed, and for her actually, and she talks about actually moral philosophy, how a moral point of view can be defined, and she basically says that the tradition of enlightenment basically goes through this notion of substitutionism, that if you want to decide what is moral to do now, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other and see if you would make the same judgment if you were the other.
You got 1 minute.
Okay, and in so doing, Ben Habib argues that the subject which is doing this substitution, puts itself in the place of the other, is actually typically a white male, and it has no particularity of his life and whatever conditions and relations he has had. So she talks about generalized other, that other which is supposed to be, we are thinking in his or her mind is a generalized other, is not a particular other. And that generalized other is created by abstraction from all these particularities, from language, from whatever gender, and so on and so forth. And she says, obviously, this is, first of all, excludes women, actually, from the remit of moral philosophy to start with, not to mention everybody else. So for her, actually, a kind of universal conception of morality in this case cannot be based on this, violent abstraction. It has to be based on bringing as many points of view as possible to the table to reflect and deliberate, which she calls interactive universalism. And I just finish in 15 seconds. And I think Jinjian Azadi, although of course whoever coined the slogan or the phrase first wouldn't say that. I mean, it's not their claim. I'm claiming that Jinjian Azadi actually is based on such a conception of universal, because it comes from a particular history, which are of the Kurds being repressed and denied and so on and so forth. So Azadi, especially in the last element, is not just about individual freedom, which of course is always talked about because it so aligns with liberal conceptions of citizenship and so on. It's also about collective freedom. And that collective brings immediately a multiplicity of human groupings. And therefore, these are the subjects of deliberation for what the society should like, what gender, and Jian's life should be organized. So I think we do have a form of interactive universalism in the slogan, and given the movement we have had in Iran and the region, there is a rich source to think about a different kind of national identity and a universality, which is not singular and repressive, but it's plural and heterogeneous. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, bunch of